So, Mark, could you maybe tell us a bit about how you started that project Optimize Better? Because then probably we'll understand a bit about the journey from being sort of a noob in the in the food and health world until where you are now. Because I think that's a journey most people will make.
Sure, and definitely in 100% English. Um, so yeah, my path started 23 years ago. Well, at the time it was 23 years ago. I was finishing school and in going into graduate school at the time, and I came basically up with symptoms of depression just out of the blue, like a lightning bolt hit me. And you can read about my whole story at length. I'm not going to go into all that, but um, I remember at the time just feeling completely helpless. There was really no internet. So getting fast answers to something that I just had no knowledge of, no at all really in terms of how I was feeling and what I was feeling, it was scary, and it was like being in the dark. And I bounced around from psychiatrist to psychiatrist. I went through every antidepressant that you could think of. If you name it, I've tried it.
Mm,
And it was just sheer madness in terms of, Albert Einstein, what he says about doing the same thing over and over again and
mm,
expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And I tried diet, I tried everything. And um, what I found, which was fascinating to me eventually, was that depression for many people is not a serotonin issue. We think, oh well, just push the serotonin button. It's the magical button that means that somehow someone will be devoid of depression. But that's it has a lot of causes,
yeah.
and I developed a lot of other conditions along the way, and I was really sick, and I was really sick for a long time. And I basically launched a biohacker interest by, generally speaking, the failures of the medical system, in as much as they simply treat symptoms and don't look for underlying cause. And
Mm,
that's what we always say in our group is do you know the underlying cause? No. Okay.
mm,
What do you think it might be? I don't know. Well, let's discuss it.
mm,
Let's see what we can find in terms of underlying cause. No doctor will ever tell you that, and no doctor is going to spend the time with you to
yeah.
identify underlying cause. And it's to no fault of their own. And I'm not denigrating doctors, but
Mm,
really and realistically, we're in an environment of doctor yourself and taking responsibility for your own health. And I'm not saying doctors don't have their place, and I'm not saying medicines don't have their place, but probably 90% of the medicines that people take are unnecessary. Maybe 80%, we can argue about that, but it's not really the point. The point
mm,
is through lifestyle changes and through understanding and fixing root cause of illness, we can rise up and we can rise again, and we can put ourselves back together again. And that should be exciting to people.
yeah.
And I think most people are overwhelmed because there's so much information, and it's just information overload. But the whole purpose of what I was trying to do and what I am doing, and really my passion of life, is to create a understanding from a skeleton, and give someone a bird's eye view into the body and the systems and how everything works in a more easy to understand and a more seamless way. So I try to write and I try to talk in shorter rather than longer. And you can see I'm a pretty big talker, so it
Mm,
is a challenge. But I do keep that in mind, and I do make an effort to make it as easily and quickly understandable for the average person.
yeah.
And so
So to be clear, like in the very basics, right?
yeah,
As far as my understanding goes, there's sort of a few major neurotransmitters, right? That's the substances in your brain that sort of steer your emotions and the way you feel, and maybe even the if you're motivated to do something. So for the depression, for example, you said the antidepressants that people usually take, they focus on boosting serotonin, but only as long as you take them, right? So it's not actually restoring your body. And for antipsychotics, for example, they limit the amount of dopamine in your system, so you don't break out sort of like that, right? And there's
Yeah.
more of these examples that actually, like you talked about, focus on the symptoms. So as the outside world, you experience certain symptoms with a person, and you don't want to be faced with those symptoms, so you put some medication on it, and then they don't bother you anymore. But what happens inside the person is often a different story, right?
Yeah, I mean, here's what's interesting is we can make sweeping generalizations and blanket statements. For instance, the immune system, in terms of inflammatory response, is involved in practically every disease we know of today. That said, it's that sounds like a general, overly simplified statement, and it is, and it's a lot more complex than that. Um, we also tend to erroneously make blanket statements like you just said, and oh, we'll just fix your serotonin
Mm.
to rise above depression and solve your depression, but it might make it worse.
Hmm.
Um, these SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they come with a slew of side effects that permanently, according to some researchers, change the architecture of your brain,
Hmm.
which may or may not be a good thing. We don't really make distinctions. And if someone goes to a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist doesn't look at, okay, well, maybe it's your dopamine. Well, maybe maybe it's your hormones. There's a lot of causes for depression. There's a lot of causes for other diseases. But what we're finding and what's interesting is dopamine under the enzyme COMT is a much more likely explanation for depression than is serotonin.
Hmm.
And if people could just understand that there's, you really want to find out which button to push, and as well invariably what button not to push, because pushing on serotonin too much could be counterproductive. There's
Yep.
GABA that could increase causes of depression. Acetylcholine, we don't understand it perfectly, but that is involved to a degree. And of course, your dopamine converts to norepinephrine, and then
Hmm.
norepinephrine to epinephrine,
Hmm.
leaving us, of course, with endorphins as the seventh neurotransmitter. And the endorphin system, I think, is finally getting some more attention with the opioid crisis. I'm sure you guys have one there to a degree.
Hmm.
Everyone seems to. But we're starting to look at the endorphin system and how that affects mood. And it's pretty fascinating because it doesn't just affect mood. You have the gut-brain axis and how your gut and how your inflammatory response to your immune system is affected. So we're looking at depression and mood disorders, and of course cognition, in terms of how the individual is affected from an inflammatory uh, frame.
Hmm. But what I was thinking about is, like you said, these medical doctors, they're not entirely useless. And of course, medical doctors themselves would say they're not entirely useless, but
Sure.
that there's some kind of money to be made there. But the thing I'm wondering is, could it be that it's an issue that they have a certain amount of time to actually spend on you as a patient, and then they're thinking, well, how can I help this patient as efficiently possible in the amount of time that I have that will actually bring a solution and will give some relief to the problems that this patient or this person has that is coming to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair statement, and we need to be fair, and we need to make distinctions because they do the best they can with the tools and the system to which they work under. And you can accept and blindly go to doctor after doctor. Hey, I did it for years,
Hmm.
and I accepted and I listened to what they said, and I did my own research to the degree that I could, but by and large, I just accepted what they said. And I'll give you a few examples. One of the conditions I had was chronic heartburn, gastroesophageal reflux disease,
Hmm.
GERD, and they gave me acid reducers, and I was on acid reducers only to find out later on that it was low stomach acid was the functional problem. And that's the functional problem for many people. 90% of non-H. pylori
So the exact
related.
opposite, you mean? So you didn't have high acid, you had low acid.
And that's one of the problems is medicine just doesn't, generally speaking, doesn't make distinctions. Everyone goes into the same box, and that's highly problematic in terms of best outcomes. So I think there's a place for both, and there's a place for medication. Some people need to be on them for certain things. We've abused antibiotics to a ridiculous degree, to the point that we now wonder whether and at what rate we have treatment-resistant bacterial strains coming. And funny story. I'm in San Diego, close to Mexico, and one of the things they had to do there was actually change the law, because people used to be able to get antibiotics over the counter, and someone gets sick and they grabbed a antibiotic, and that was just how people dealt with sickness, and the government had to essentially make it a controlled substance. So in Mexico, an antibiotic is basically the same as Xanax would be here. And you need a prescription and all that, which anyways. I think it's important to understand your own chemistry and understand your own needs. And if a doctor can only spend 5 minutes with you, diagnostically, in terms of blood work and whatnot, which you should do, he knows that better than you. But in terms of you knowing your own body and you being able to figure out what works and what doesn't, and knowing that, for instance, you had a bad reaction to an antihistamine. Okay, so what is that telling us? That's a huge amount of information. And no doctor's going to say, okay, well, that means that. So accepting some responsibility within is probably the new framework, until we get better with genetic testing, to where genetic testing can basically tell us exactly what we need to do in terms of an actual puzzle.
Yeah, but then in the Netherlands, it's the case that in the health sciences or in medicine school, like in university, they don't actually get that much of how do you say it, food studies. So they don't actually know what food does in your body, or what the certain substances in the food do with your body, or in interaction with the medication that they're actually prescribing. So to me, that has always been a sort of a shortcoming in these universal studies, and it's like, to me, that feels like the basics, right? First you need to know what goes in, what comes out, and then you start actually making changes to that basics. So, and what would you say is like the basic way to go about getting to know your own body, in terms of, I have some kind of symptom, what could be the issue right now?
Well, yeah, the food one's a big one. I remember reading one time that 95% of medical doctors, these are people that have a medical degree, take one or no classes in nutrition. Yeah, I mean, it's like not understanding. Think if you had a car and it required a certain grade or diesel gas, and you're putting in the wrong gas. Yeah, it's huge. I think that, again, one of the big things you see is these quote unquote diet wars, and you're seeing in the health space that this emotional attachment to being right about the universal diet that's right for everyone, and it's and everyone gets sucked into it, and you can tell the people that are most new to whatever diet they're experimenting with, they have the biggest emotional attachment to it. You see this with people that continue on with it, but I think the need to customize, again, and the need to experiment is important, and no doctor is going to tell you that, well, this diet might work better for this person or another. I know what works for me, and I'm not evangelical about it, and I don't try to tell people that they need to be on the diet I am, because what works for me is not necessarily going to work for the next person. I know it works for me because I've tried everything.
Mm.
And that's the only reason I know. And I've gotten the feedback and the results. And I tried it with an open mind.
Yeah.
And very few people, I think, are into that and into looking at, okay, so how subjectively does diet X, Y, or Z affect you? And this is huge. You know, your diet.
How did you actually go about like taking these steps in figuring out what kind of diet works for you? Do you start making a log or something? Do you note your symptoms? How does that work?
Well, there's two ways. You can go about it the specific route where you find out and identify if you have a food allergy.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's specific food allergies. You can go to an allergist and get screened. I did that. And it gets real technical, it gets real specific. For
Mm.
instance, a nut allergy. Okay, so you think, okay, well, I'm allergic to nuts. No, you might be just allergic to cashews.
Mm.
Um, so you want to find that out. And then, of course, you want to understand your gut and how foods work for you, because our gut microbiome is massive. It basically dictates our health. So
Mm.
what's right for you could be right for me, generally speaking, or it could be polar opposite, or it could be partially right. I notice myself that I have a hard time breaking down protein,
Mm.
especially animal protein, and even more so animal fats. I'm allergic to dairy. I figured that out. So it made sense eventually to try a plant-based diet. And I found that I have more energy, I have more mood today than I did, half my age, which sounds crazy and unbelievable. And
Mm.
it's not a testimony to the quote unquote plant-based diet. It's a testimony to the plant-based diet, how it interacts with my gut microbiome.
Mm.
Trillions of bacteria, and this idea that everyone needs to be on keto or everyone
Mm.
needs to be on vegan, BS. That can't be true. I've seen people that get on my diet and they put on 20, 30 pounds.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously that's some feedback that it's not right for them.
Mm.
Um, so I found also that fiber, if there's anything universally true,
Mm.
I found that 95% of people don't eat enough fiber. And no matter what diet you're on, fiber
Uh,
could change your life, because prebiotics, which is in fiber, it
mm.
fuels and it feeds your gut microbiome. This is huge. So this is something that anyone can do on any diet. And people say, well, I'm on low carb or
Mm.
what. Yeah, that's fine. There's the fiber works really on any diet, low carb or high carb. So that and the other big one is intermittent fasting,
Mm.
specifically for people like me. I later found out that I had basically a what's called COMT. It's the enzyme that processes metabolizes your stress hormones, dopamine, of course, and dopamine converting to norepinephrine and epinephrine. So what happens is, and this is believed, of course, and I believe it. I'm open to evidence that shows
Mm.
I'm wrong, but I believe that, and this is how you see people that can drink caffeine all day long, or
Mm.
part of the explanation. Caffeine is a catechol, which is what your COMT enzyme metabolizes. And this is why someone opposite of me could drink, half a cup of coffee and they have a panic attack.
Mm.
Well, this could possibly be explained by their COMT enzyme metabolizing catechols, which basically affect dopamine too slowly. So for me, a lot of my strategy in terms of maximizing energy and my mood is
Mm.
to inhibit, meaning slow down my COMT, and also A and B, which is, I'm sure you're
Mm.
familiar with. MAO-A inhibitors is a common, a common drug or
Maybe you should explain like a bit for the common listeners, like MAO is and how would you call that in English? Um, Monoamine oxidases, something like that, right?
you
So
got it.
in your brain you have some monoamines, and that's like the big ones, I believe, is dopamine and serotonin, right? Maybe there's something else.
Yeah,
But and the thing that MAO does is it breaks that down. It oxidizes those so that it's like sort of reduced. And the MAO-I, so the inhibitor, it prevents that breaking down, so it stays for longer in your brain, in intact state. But
yeah,
and what you were telling about, like you have a certain shortage of COMT, as I understand correctly, and your focus seems to be on a food lifestyle and sort of, yeah, the sort of the way the things you intake naturally. But there's also the route probably of adding enzymes or adding probiotics. What would you say about that? Because I think it's all the rage, right? You can buy these big bottles with capsules, and some people seem to be a really big fan about that.
so 50% of people, we believe, probiotics will not work for.
Mm,
It basically won't interact with the gut microbiome
mm.
in a way that would have a clinical effect. Um, so which one are you?
And
Which one am I?
I took it for a while, and maybe what I discovered is that I took this large amount of strains, right? So 15 strains. Mostly they only have one or two or four or something like that. So it's very few different strains of bacteria.
Yeah,
And I had a large bacterial count, so maybe 30 million or something like that.
yeah,
And I noticed it helped for when I had inflammation in my jaw. So that
yeah,
was beneficial. But what I also noticed is that the moment I stopped taking them, the effect was gone.
yeah.
So it's sort of like your normal nutrition. You need to keep taking it and keep taking it. I'm wondering about what the effect is on the natural production that takes place in your gut microbiome. So if the bacteria that are there naturally, how they will be affected by these probiotics.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction. Prebiotics dietary fiber, and of course there's soluble and insoluble fiber. Prebiotic is generally considered the best form in terms of your gut microbiome being able to benefit from. And I think that's fundamentally how I feel, and it's a big part of controlling my mood and energy. Uh, and here's an interesting thing. And you were talking about these three enzymes. They the speed to which they metabolize your stress hormones, or catecholamines, which would be dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and of course estrogen is involved. And then on the other side, MAO-A and B, which is serotonin, and then serotonin with the three stress hormones. So the faster it clears, the more, and this is just, no one can prove this one way or the other. It's just a theory I have. And again, I'm open to being wrong about it.
Mm.
But the faster it clears, genetically speaking, in terms of how the genes express themselves, the worse you feel. So if it clears really fast, that means essentially low dopamine activity. And that's
Mhm.
when people say, I have low dopamine. Well, it's not necessarily that, and again, this is my belief, that you have low dopamine activity, and or you have low dopamine activity in a certain part of the brain, but it's your enzyme clearing it and metabolizing it too quickly. So if it invariably clears it too fast or too slow, again, this is an untested theory, this could potentially explain anxiety and
Mm.
other, glutamate-oriented disorders. Um, you
For
know,
the listeners, glutamate is sort of the main accelerant in your brain, right? It makes you, if you have too much of it, you get very hyper, so
yeah,
hyperactive. Yeah,
it's like Goldilocks. You want to
yeah.
be just right with
Mm.
you don't want um, you don't want your dopamine to be cleared too quickly, and you don't want it to be cleared too slowly. Both are
Mm.
not good, and they produce different effects.
And probably
So
the answer
intermittent,
is probably the answer is then in an enzyme, if your theory is correct, and not in some sort of medication that is prescribed at this moment.
I mean, a medication can slow down dopamine. It can
Mm.
also, do the opposite. Fight again, and I think this is where we tend not to make distinctions that harm us. 5-HTP, suppresses dopamine, and people take it thinking, well, and this is amino acid, of course. Well, I need 5-HTP for depression. Maybe you don't. Maybe it's making it worse, especially if dopamine is your problem.
If dopamine's your problem, yeah. But then again, maybe most people don't realize it, but serotonin and dopamine are in a sort of a balance, right? Because they also make use of the same cofactors, as we call it, in this this area of science, for example, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about that at length in our private discussions, right? Is this the B6, magnesium, zinc, etc. And those cofactors, those substances that are maybe normally in your food if you eat the right foods, or maybe in your supplements if you need to supplement them, they run out at a certain point if you produce too much of one type of neurotransmitter, and then the other just gets produced less. So
Yeah.
that's why these serotonin and dopamine are in a balance, right? And you need to figure out what kind of balance you want and what the problem actually is before you start supplementing very vigorously in one or the other direction.
Yeah, and I think again, it's not. We tend to make the overgeneralization that dopamine and serotonin are opposing each other, which they are and they're not. There's a relationship, but it's not that simple. So again, it's important to understand, and it's important to figure out what works best for you, and that's something that I stress. If you've been going to a psychiatrist for 10 years and you're getting nowhere, maybe it's time to look, for other alternatives. And of course, people would slam someone saying this, that that's irresponsible, and they need to do everything under the care of their doctor.
Well, let's talk about how you would go about this in a sensible way. Like how could you be like cautious and prepare yourself really well before you actually start ordering, I don't know what type of supplements through Vitacost or whatever site you like.
Yeah.
But like first prepare yourself, and then how would you go about this? Like the very simple steps, basic steps. What?
Well,
Yeah.
we were talking about it earlier. Start with diet first. Start with
Mm.
lifestyle first. It's not as sexy, and people are generally going to not going to, they're going to ignore what I just said, and even though there's a lot of truth in it, because again, it's not as fun, and they'll go right for the supplements. I get it. I mean, we're all like that to a degree.
Like we say in Dutch, spruitjes eten.
Like you have to eat the, how do you say it, the small sprouts, yeah, Brussels sprouts, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a pretty boring for most people, but like eating whole grain foods, for example, or eating the right amount of vegetables, so that kind of thing, right? And so normally the green vegetables or cauliflower or broccoli, they would have magnesium and all kinds of interesting nutrients in them. But like you said, it's not very sexy to advise somebody to actually eat 200 grams of vegetables each day and just keep on going with that for the rest of their lives, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you from a perspective of slowing down dopamine, slowing down the clearance of dopamine in the body, and inhibiting it. There is a diet that works for it. So I think here's a easy question that someone can ask themselves that has some sort of truth to it. How does caffeine make you feel? Now, our liver metabolizes caffeine as well. There's a liver enzyme, and it's not just the enzymes that we've been talking about. So going from that, how do berries make you feel? How does green tea make you feel? How do bananas make you feel? How do you feel when you do intermittent fasting, which everyone should try, and it does raise dopamine. How does protein make you feel? So those are generally the strategies. Cocoa, obviously. Do these things make you feel a lot better? And if they do, that is telling us, do you get a panic attack after having some caffeine? Okay. Dopamine, you might have too much dopamine and your body might be clearing it too slowly. So the opposite could be true. So for me, again, I watch fiber and I do intermittent fasting, and I'm mainly plant-based. That are some of my keys. I'm not suggesting that this is right for everyone, and I'm absolutely not. But it might be, and it might. I think fiber could definitely help some people. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Even though I do intermittent fasting, protein stabilizes dopamine as well. So even though I'm doing intermittent fasting, I still take some protein outside of my eating window. So I think that's where people get confused, as you have too many moving parts. So like you said, start with one thing and master it. Okay, I've done this for a week. I feel better. All right, what's next? At that point, once someone starts feeling better, they start asking, okay, what else can I do? What else do I need? They should look at medications that might be making themselves worse. Antihistamines, for instance, which is a common drug. Anything it says anticholinergic, and they can look it up. And we get this question a lot: is, well, I have brain fog, I have trouble remembering things, I have trouble thinking, I don't feel so good. And you ask them, are you on an anticholinergic? Yeah. Okay. You might want to talk to your doctor about that, because the evidence is pretty clear in terms of what's happening and what effect that's having on the body in terms of the brain. Harvard University Medical School just put out an advisory on it. I mean, this is easily accessible, pretty much open, open information.
Yeah, and the antihistamines you're talking about, that would be medication that people commonly take for hay fever, for example, right?
Yeah.
Or like if they have a continuous itch on their body, something like that. So that's indeed in the Netherlands as well. That's a pretty common medication. And I think
Xanax, Valium, even like you guys have Tylenol, I'm sure Tylenol PM, all of these medications that that are either antihistamine or anticholinergic are problematic to the brain. So things that we're doing could be making ourselves worse. It's not just a matter of what's not in our body.
Yeah. So lifestyle-wise speaking, right? There could be. I think this is also on your website, right? There's something with the rhythm you have in your day, like how many hours do you work, how many hours do you sleep, what's the kind of exercise you do, for example. So what would be your take on that, like the influence that has on the neurotransmitter levels and the way it makes you feel?
Well, I mean, sleep is a good one to start. We all need different numbers of sleep. Some people need more, some people need less, some people need a lot less, some people need a lot more. You can get a sleep app, and I mean, they're free, and you can start sleeping with an app and getting data, and then figuring out how much sleep you need. Other lifestyle. Here's an interesting one. A new study proved that 22 minutes of walking is as effective as a blood pressure medication.
So just regular walking, just going outside, taking a walk around the block, and then
22 minutes, and they found the benefits increased over above and beyond 22 minutes. But I mean, the average person, that's anyone can go for a walk unless you're in a wheelchair. And this is something within our grasp, and you see people with pulse issues, high pulse, go for a walk. Probably the single best thing you can do to bring your pulse down. It's basically a natural blood pressure strategy. Wim Hof breathing, that's another one that I think, especially for people with anxiety, it gives them, again, this is a theory, people that have anxiety, and I don't experience anxiety, so I'm trying to imagine how the neurotransmitters of someone and someone's subjective experience of anxiety feels. It allows them to have that feeling of being in control of not just their breathing, but their chemistry. And, and it gives them a sense of confidence. As well, within the Wim Hof breathing, they do the Wim Hof method, they do cold showers. I do both. And it sounds bizarre, taking a cold shower, but I can tell you it feels amazing. And they become addictive after a while. And I can give you a tip on how to make these easy. But
how do you make them easy? Because I've tried this, right? And I get to lukewarm, but that's about it.
So Wim, if this is and who am I to disagree with the maker of the method? But he says you just turn it on full blast to cold, which you can do, and that's a possibility. I've found you get in there, and I found that the best time to start doing this is when it's not cold. So you guys obviously have a cold winter there. I mean, it doesn't really, it's a joke. What we consider cold in California, you guys would probably laugh at. But I tell people start during the summer when it's warm. It takes a few days to get used to it. But you make sure the bathroom is warm. So if you have a heater in there, turn on the heater, especially during the winter. You get in there, and this is the way I do it now. I start on neutral, and then I believe in the theory of illusion of control. So if your body feels like it's in control, so you're tricking your body to get used to the cold a lot easier. And again, this is opposite of what Wim says. He says you just turn it on full blast. He says you can start with it at hot and then you just go cold. But I think it's too big of a contrast. What I do is I do neutral, and I soap up, and then I'll step away and I put my head under the shower. I still do it this way, and I put my head and I turn it all the way to cold, and I let it sit for maybe 10 seconds. At that point, my body's gotten used to the temperature, and then I remove my head and let it hit my body, and no problem. When it was cold to me, I would do, like the gladiator and bang my knees, or, 300. And it's like a primal kind of scream. And again, it's that illusion of control that you're in
I recognize that one. Yeah.
and your body, again, it's perfectly fine with it. You can jump in place a little. You can pound your hips, the wall, yell. But I mean, it becomes very easy, and it becomes part of your routine. I
do the walrus, right? Like that kind of thing.
It
works. Yeah.
I had to do this for because my boiler was broke, and I really need to shower every day. I cannot live without a shower once a day at least. So I had to go to my work, and the boiler didn't work. So then I had only one option: take a cold shower. And you get used to it very fast.
But then for the advantages, what does this do for you health-wise?
Well, first and foremost, because we are in the coronavirus, if you have an active infection, not just a coronavirus, but if you have cold, the flu, do not do this. If you have an autoimmune disease and it's currently flaring, do not do this. So this is a strategy to do when your immune system is not compromised, and it basically builds and boosts your immune system. It raises endorphins, which of course that's one of the things it does, and as well your endorphins boost your mood. It's one of the 7 primary neurotransmitters. It improves your cardiovascular system. We're getting data on that. We believe it improves lung function, the endothelial function in the cardiovascular system. It improves blood pressure, we believe. There's a few studies on it, but there's a few more coming. And it's just, basically you're tapping into your natural energy and mood source and regulation. And it's, 2 minutes, that's all you need. And you can put a timer in your bathroom. It goes by real fast. And all I can say is, stick with it. It might be tough for a few days. I don't think it is or was. And the better you feel, the more you're going to want to do it, and the more you're going to get excited to do it, which sounds weird that you can get excited to take a cold shower, but you're going to be feeling really good very shortly. Some people say it helps them with sleep. It does stimulate, so you wouldn't want to take it right before bed. So a lot of people say they take it 90 minutes before bed, something like that.
Okay.
Some people take it in the morning as like an alternative to coffee. But those are the benefits. Intermittent fasting, I mentioned earlier, is key. I do 200 push-ups. I gave up my gym. Yeah, I gave up my gym membership. I was a member of a gym, and it was just a biohacking thing. I wanted to see if my lifestyle would control my ability to if I'd still be able to manage weight without going to the gym. And yeah, it's been over a year now. And
yeah, because I noticed there was some discussion about this, at least in the Netherlands. Maybe you also had it in the USA, right? Due to the coronavirus, the Dutch government decided to actually close down the gyms.
Yeah.
Because that would be too much of a risk of infection. Of course, there's something to be said for that. But what I was also thinking is that people that are this careful with their health and this much focused on how to deal with those kinds of things, they would have an immune system that's through the roof, right? So, what is your take on that? Like, and would this actually be a way to prevent the outbreak of corona within a certain area?
Well, yeah, that's the $1 million question. I think there's a lot of truth to it. Again, overly simplified because the immune system is incredibly complex, and not everyone's immune system is going to react the same exactly as everyone else. So again, we'll speak in generalities for the purpose of the fact that there's a time restriction here. Vitamin D is real interesting. Several years ago, I think it was 2016, an article and a study came out suggesting that it's more effective than the flu shot in terms of adverse outcomes. And so what we think here that we're experiencing and we're getting more evidence of is that our need for vitamin D is substantially greater than the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, has been for a long time. And we get blood tests that tell us our vitamin D levels, and it's measured in nanograms per milliliter. When you see your blood level of vitamin D.
Just before we get further on in the story, would you say that could be the effect of us in the northern regions, or at least too distant from the equator, that we have too little sunlight to actually produce that amount of vitamin D in our bodies ourselves?
Yeah, and this is going to sound terrible, and I'm sure people love to nitpick, but I don't know how efficient absorbing vitamin D from the sun really is. And there's a lot of logistical issues, like you mentioned, the geography. Darker skinned people can't, because of melanin, can not convert the hormone as easily. If you're older, if you have obviously an autoimmune disease, if you have if you have high blood pressure, if you have diabetes, any of these metabolic diseases are going to inhibit your ability. Your age, men, your ACE2. Your ACE2 expression, which are lower in men and are lower as you get older. So there's a lot of factors here, and it's a great question that you asked. And this question I ask is, if we just distributed vitamin D and told people to take it, would that alleviate the problem to some degree? I believe so. And they found that insufficiency of vitamin D is the more likely explanation for adverse outcomes with influenza A, which is, should be why aren't we talking about that?
Yeah.
What as a society,
I think, but I believe that also they did some research on that it has an effect on the the way that COVID-19 progresses, right? And along with some other substances, right, like zinc and I don't know, that's some different substances that actually influence the progression of the disease.
Yeah, and absolutely. There's a ton on vitamin D. I think we'll have some on zinc. I think that's without question. If you're taking a vitamin D supplement, and again, no one will tell you this, you have to be and I don't know how you get it from diet. Average person can't, but you need a sufficient amount of magnesium. So people typically take a D3 supplement that has K2 in it. K keeps the calcium in where it should be in your bones and not in your arteries, which is the #1 cause of death worldwide, arteriosclerosis. But the magnesium helps you actually absorb supplemental vitamin D, and you don't really see that. But yeah, you need to have your micronutrients. Selenium is coming up. In the past, iodine was basically a full spectrum antiviral. It hasn't really been coming up as a match here. But yeah, I mean, we have all the micronutrients that in vitamins and minerals that we need, and omega-3s. We're seeing some evidence on that as well, and that's a pretty common deficiency that seemingly is a key supplement that people can take. I certainly have it on my top 5 list. But yeah, I think the evidence is, as far as I'm concerned, is crystal clear on vitamin D and the insufficiency of it. And again, you're seeing adverse populations in the African American and darker skin communities than you are in lighter skin communities. Why is this? Sure, it could be it could be socioeconomic status, type of demographic issues, but as well it could be strictly or it could be as well a vitamin D issue, and a greater level of vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency collectively versus society generally speaking. And I think we'll get those, and there's a few, and I put them in a paper that I wrote. So
usually we in this program we deal with topics that sort of try to exclude the government as a sort of a steering wheel in society, right?
Sure.
That's hence the name of our show, Steer Less, or in Dutch, Stuurloos. So in this regard, there's a reason we asked you on the show, right? Because I think I at least believe that there's a way to avoid all this government regulation and to avoid the protocols that are behind it in treating certain diseases. So for cancer, for example, there's an entire protocol that the government agreed upon with the cancer doctors. So they say, well, this is the kind of protocol we need to follow. And if that protocol is finished, then if you want to do something else, according to European regulations, you can actually do whatever you like as long as you talk about it with your physician.
Right.
So what would you say is could there be a way out of this entire forest of regulations and of at least, I think, to me also confusing information for the regular population, in a way of focusing more on say food and lifestyle and supplements, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
And what would need to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we have a few factors here. One is, again, we need to get better at making distinctions. Not all doctors are bad, not all medical services are bad. If you're in an accident or giving live birth, there's no better place to be. Yeah. We need that. We absolutely need that. And again, you're in their hands, and you're trusting them 100%, and you're on your own. One of the reasons for health, obviously, is to as a great a degree as possible, try to avoid being there, of course, short of live births or an accident. But we want to take care of our health so that we aren't in the emergency room. That's not a good place to be. And at the same time, personal responsibility, I think, is the only way out of this. We had a law called Obamacare. I don't know if you guys heard of that. It was basically an attempt to change our medical system. and it's heavily politicized, and back and forth, and a lot of ideology in it, and it's missing the point. There is not enough. There will never be enough government health care, never, for what we're experiencing. The United States is 33 pounds heavier than the rest of the world.
That would be like sort of if you carry the weight of an infant, maybe 4-year-old around all day, right?
Yeah.
Like every single person in society.
I mean, here's a radical thought, and it's amazing that I need to say radical, but we went into a quarantine 3 months ago. And, proactively, the government could have said, and I think the government has some responsibility for making common sense, leadership, educational type of statements. They could have said, we are overweight. And when you're overweight, you are immune compromised, period. You are now at risk of an adverse outcome of this virus that a lot of people are afraid of. Do something about it. Instead, we probably gain more weight staying indoors and not exercising and eating garbage food. And but I don't know. I know for a fact I can say that there will never be enough government health care for what we're experiencing, and for an obese society that doesn't seem to want, generally speaking, take care of themselves and at least their own health. There is no way out. I mean, education is the only way, and getting people to realize that they do need to participate. They need to take responsibility for their health, and but at the same token, you have to want it. And Dr. Saul, who was an early influence of mine, that's what he says in the documentary, great documentary called Food Matters. And he says, you have to want health. You have to reach for it. You have to grab it. And if you don't want it, how can I? There's nothing I can say.
But you've experienced like this period before Obamacare, right? And to come back to your earlier statement that there will never be enough healthcare from government. I believe there's a sort of the effect in that the more government takes care of people, the more people become dependent on the government for that care. So they'll be more and more and more dependent, and it will require an increase in government every time. So
it's self-fulfilling, and
yeah. And then to go back to the period before Obamacare, because I believe there was in Dutch society some people frowned upon that, right? There was a large part of your population that was not insured for healthcare. So how did it work in that period? Were people more mindful of their own health, or did more people die, or what happened?
Well, again, this is where distinctions come about. We tend to think in America, and Americans definitely think black and white. All or nothing. We're extreme left, we're extreme right, and that's generally the battle that we have now. It shouldn't cost you, $30,000 to go to a hospital. The price gouging is part of the problem as well. So it's people need to do their part to not run up the costs, and the costs will always be run up when you have people that are, generally speaking, on an aggregate, more sick than they were before, more fat than they were before, less healthy than they were before. And again, now we have the opioid crisis. We have depression is still rising. We have done nothing with it, and we failed in terms of bringing down the #1 cause of disability worldwide. We've no innovation, generally speaking, so you have the price gouging combined with the lack of personal responsibility, combined with the disease increasing. So it's sort of a perfect storm. To say that people are taking less responsibility now versus before, I wouldn't say that. Again, I mean, it's just an observation. I do notice, and I go for a walk every day, and I recommend that people do that. It's one of the best things you can do. I notice more people walking. But is this a short-fleeted trend that in America's big on trends? They get all excited about one thing and then 3 weeks later you don't hear about it. We're big on that, jumping cart from one to another. I don't know. I mean, something has to change because it's unsustainable, and it's long since unsustainable, and it's a huge part of our GDP. So eventually we'll cripple our economy at the rate we're going. But it's not popular for a politician to be saying what I'm saying, and I think you alluded to it. And I don't think you're going to have a politician saying, "Hey, guess what we need to do starting next month? It's lose 10 pounds a month." Wrong answer. Wrong answer. But it would make a massive difference.
Well, but then again, that in the beginning of this whole COVID crisis in the United States, Trump said, well, in rising degrees of taking it more seriously, but he started out with saying, this is nothing. It will blow over in a week and nobody will talk about it ever. And now you're over 100,000 deaths. So how does the own responsibility of people come into play here?
Because we've lost. My really close friend, he says we need to take back the middle. And what is the middle? It's using ration, reason, common sense, and the fact that everything's been politicized. You can't say a thing without it turning into a political conversation, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We all breathe air. We all drink water. We share a lot of things in common. We don't need to turn it into this red team versus blue team kind of commentary all the time. And that's basically what we've done and where we've gone as a society. And we need political parties like yourself that is alternative to the two, and we can't. And hopefully, someday we'll have a viable third party, and that to go all the way back to your question, that's probably the only solution to where we're at. And yeah, the fact that we just go from extremes. We had a bank crisis 15 years ago. Well, not that long ago. We used to lend money to anyone. You could fog up a mirror. You could get a loan for $500,000. Well, it crashed the economy. How do we respond? Polar opposite. You need to prove without a shadow of a doubt that you have never needed any type of funding of any kind, that you can qualify for the funding, that you will always be able to qualify for the funding, and that you'll never not need this funding, even though you're asking for this funding ever again. And it's just this swinging to the opposite extreme of these absurd positions. And collective absurd positions. It needs to simmer down. With choice and with having a viable third party, this could potentially bring it about, and this could potentially bring about change. But there's several factors going on.
Yeah, to just see it from a Dutch perspective. If Dutch people look towards the United States, then mostly the people would vote Democratic Party, right? But if you look at the political programs of both parties, to me as a libertarian, they both seem like different shades of purple instead of blue and red, right? So it's a choice between two shades of the same party, and it's sort of a weird battle going on between, like the same as you have in China. Which would be cursing in the church almost for American people, right? But in China, you also have one party, the Communist Party, and there are different factions within it, and they seem to have a lively debate. But in the end, the outcome is communist, and to a large extent, that seems to be the same in the United States. You have two parties; they disagree on some points, but mostly they have the same outcome, more or less.
Yeah, a real easy thing to think of and consider is pharma, the Pharmaceutical Association. They own every single politician. Doesn't matter. They cover all bets. They hedge all bets, and they own every single politician. So if you need to see how the system is broken, and was not what the original founders of the Constitution of the United States had in mind, and opposite of what they were, where they're going, look no further. And yeah, I mean, they're basically the same except for a cultural difference. And there's a culture war that was started a long time ago, and that's basically the predominant dominating theme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I think. If you have a third party and everybody starts to vote a third or a fourth party, like Libertarian or Green Party, eventually the lobbyists will come and will also bribe these people. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll, in all fairness, I don't know the political system in other countries, but I believe, and I could be wrong, that in Europe you see a three-party system a lot more. I believe the UK has one. I could be wrong. You guys would know more than me.
Yeah, the USA has also more parties. You have the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, even the Socialist Party.
Well, you could take
Ralph Nader.
You could take the Netherlands, for example. I don't have an exact count in my head, but it's somewhere around 10 different parties in parliament. And there's some larger than others, of course, but there's sort of like 10 different parties.
Yeah.
So you could make a comparison with that.
Yeah, I mean, we have two basically that dominate. Yeah, there's other parties, but until they get to a 15% was I think what I last saw percent of the vote. We basically have a two-party system.
That would be a large threshold, right? I believe the threshold in the Netherlands would be somewhere around 2/3%, because that's one seat in parliament.
Well, no. I mean, in terms of a major political, we have, I think, one senator that's independent. But I'm saying in terms of a presidential candidate getting 15% of the vote, I want to say Ross Perot got like 10 or 12%. Gary Johnson, who was the Libertarian candidate in 2016, he was polling at 15%. This was a big deal. And then he made a comment showing
Aleppo,
ethnocentrism.
What is Aleppo? You have to Google it, what Aleppo is.
But yeah, I think that that was rough.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, so we have a lot of time left, so I was thinking we could maybe go into the details a bit more, right? Like talk about some of the main diseases that are plaguing this, not only USA, but I think worldwide, right? Like cardiovascular disease, like cancer, like all sorts of neurological disorders. What are some of the besides the lifestyle and the food intake, what are some of the main substances that play a large role in this, and what should people be mindful of?
Well, I think cholesterol is probably a really good starting point. We have 40 million Americans now on cholesterol statin medications.
And to be clear, statin is just like to dilute your blood, right? So it's thinner.
Well, a statin medication lowers your cholesterol. That's, yes, it will lower your numbers. And when we look at cholesterol, we want to make some distinctions. There's LDL. There's HDL. That's considered, and I'll speak in the most general terms, that's considered your good cholesterol. So more is better. LDL, generally, we consider less is better. And there's a distinction there. I'll get to that one in a second. And then there's your triglycerides. Your triglycerides, is typically triglycerides. You want them lower, and you want your HDL higher. Those are the easily manipulatable two markers when you get your blood test. LDL. It's not the LDL that matters. It's the oxidation of the LDL that matters. So again, this comes all the way back to the inflammation discussion we were having at the very beginning. So you want to understand inflammation in your body. I believe the only way there's a calcium channel scan, which I think people can do and might want to consider depending on their age, age factor and risk factor. And they're pretty cheap now. I want to say like $80. But you can find out whether you have inflammation in your arteries.
This is an interesting point, for example, because I believe in the USA you have sort of private clinics where you can just apply for certain tests, right? And in the Netherlands that's not so very common. But I want to just stress to people that in the Netherlands you also have these private clinics, but you have to specifically look for them. The standard way to go for people in the Netherlands would be to go to their general house physician and you just ask the question there and then be referred to some other doctor without too much control of the whole process. But to be clear, the same option is there in the Netherlands, but you need to look for it. So just to add to that story. Yeah,
so you can do additional tests that may or may not be covered or offered in your actual health clinic, and there's private, there's all kinds of private testing that you can have done now. The point is, we need to understand what cholesterol really is. We tend to think of it, again, because as Americans, and I think worldwide, people tend to have this blanket assumption that, cholesterol is bad. Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely not the case. We need cholesterol. Our sex hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. So, strip all the cholesterol out of your body and see how you're doing in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. It might be a big problem. We don't know yet on statin medication. And my position has been that we should have known this and we should have determined this before unilaterally, blindly just putting people on these medications. Mm-hmm. But they come with significant risks. One is liver toxicity, and the other is, well, there's three that are predominant. Muscle pain, liver toxicity, obviously that's a huge problem. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't even need to explain that one. And then the acceleration of the risk of type 2 diabetes. Mm-hmm. Now, Alzheimer's and dementias is a believed risk, and we have conflicting studies on that. And to be fair in all intellectual honesty, we don't know if it's linked. And we don't know, again, when we have serotonin involved, which is, to some degree involved in mood issues, we don't know the effects of mood and cognition. And I think we will eventually. But it is something to think about that may or may not be a long-term risk with statin medications. But the fact is, independent, meaning in advance of a cardiac event, there's no evidence that a statin drug provides any benefit that I'm aware of. I've researched this pretty extensively for the last 15 years, I want to say. There's no evidence that we're put of the efficacy of a drug that we're putting 40 million people on to lower a believed risk in the face of an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, which is an actual risk. Yeah. And
what would you say is, like, for people with cardiovascular disease that are on statins that are probably prescribed with a certain type of reasoning in mind, but what would you say is a viable alternative, like in the short run, right, to give relief to those people, short of this health or lifestyle issues, because they normally take some time to take effect, right? So they would probably need something in between to relieve these problems instead of statins that only give that give a lot of side effects.
Yeah, I wrote about these, and there's an article on my website on the cardiovascular system, and it explains these more in depth. I'll go through them pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Again, we mentioned 95% of people don't eat enough fiber. I think they get 50% of their fiber needs. Mm-hmm. This is, right there's a problem. Of course, obesity is of issue. Simply walking can be efficacious. But niacin is vitamin B3 in the flushing form, meaning the one that turns you red. Now, don't take the full dose all at once. You have to build up, otherwise it's going to be quite uncomfortable. But they found that, and they patented a niacin B3 drug, which is a slow release, I believe. I could be wrong. Called Niaspan, I think. Now, in the slow release form, you have the same possible risk of liver toxicity that statin drugs do. Other people will take red yeast rice, which is a natural type of statin, which as well could potentially have the same risk. But niacin, and it's what's called instant release. You'll just see it straight niacin, not niacinamide, and of course not sustained, delayed, or prolonged release. Fixes your lipid panel probably better than anything. They found dosage. One study found as little as 500 milligrams completely overhauls your liver, your cholesterol panel, your lipid panel. And then they found as much as 3 grams for some people, depending on individual needs. It will lower your LDL. It will lower your total cholesterol to some degree. It will lower your triglycerides substantially, and it will raise your HDL substantially. At more than 2 grams, they found that it can potentially increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. So typically when you go onto alternative websites, they say 3 grams a day. I tend to think 2 grams should do it, and maybe less. Just 500 milligrams of it for me raised my HDL by 50% and lowered my triglycerides by 2/3. So it works.
Yeah, but for you then also that monitoring your health requires regular testing also. So that would be like testing once a month, or how often do you?
Every 6 months.
Every 6 months.
Twice a year, I get a blood panel.
Yeah.
And you want to get once you have 3 tests done, you have now a baseline, and you have some data that you can look back and forth on. And yeah, you should know what you're looking at, and you with all these supplements, they have the potential. I mean, it's rare, but they have the potential to interact with liver and kidney enzymes. So you would want to verify that something you're taking is not causing damage now rather than later. So 6 months is a pretty good rule of thumb.
But to make this sort of easy, right? Would you say, are there some type of apps that you can actually monitor your health in that way that you're doing so rigorously right now? So maybe your blood panel, you have that in some sort of spreadsheet or something, and in the app you can just add the scan that you have had made and those kinds of things, or maybe some app that I think Google Fit does something like that, right? Like with your blood pressure and your heart rate, and maybe in a more basic way.
I don't think those Fitbits and the wrist ones are. I think they're working on it, but I don't think they're good enough to monitor blood pressure. But I think once they do, that will be a big deal, because blood pressure is absolutely huge, and I think too many people ignore it and they wait for their doctor. I think you should check your blood pressure a lot more often than every 6 months, especially if you're not, if you're high risk. But a lot of your doctors are online now, so they'll have an online system, and you can log in and look at your past records. I'm not aware of any app. I'm sure there is one that you can track everything. But I generally at this point I know what I'm doing, and as it pertains to me, and that's really the goal, is to know your own chemistry.
But you sort of use a spreadsheet to actually have all these different values after each other. You don't make graphs or anything like that. You just know what it should be at, and then you're saying, oh, it was a bit high this month, so maybe I need to mind this or that a little more. Yeah,
blood pressure, it's going to vary. And I think a lot of people, like someone, for instance, who they don't know, they'll go eat a meal or drink some coffee and then check their blood pressure, and then they notice it's spiked. And then they freak out. Well, no, this is why you need, a base of data, and you need other, you test it under different scenarios. A lot of people don't know that, your nocturnal blood pressure is a lot bigger factor in determining your health risk and how healthy you are than your daytime blood pressure. Why is that? Because our blood pressure naturally rises during the day. So, a lot of people will say, well, I can't eat salt because my blood pressure rises. Well, yeah, that's true. And maybe 2% of the people out there that have hypertension that are legitimately what are called sodium sensitive, meaning it spikes their blood pressure for a prolonged period of time. But, you know, looking at something and saying, well, I can't do this because it raises my blood pressure, and the translation is it raises my blood pressure temporarily. That's not a good fit. Getting out of bed raises your blood pressure. So does that mean we're just, you know, we're going to avoid that activity?
Yeah, so like maybe taking out these kind of nervous tendencies of people to do actually overmind their health, right? It's like what are the main overestimations that people have in your experience? Like what type of foods do they avoid, or what type of activities, or what are the main stories you've heard about that?
Here's a good rule of thumb that I use. There's a war on we already talked about salt. There's a war on carbs, carbohydrates. Again, no distinctions made. Carbs are bad for you. Okay. There's a lot in that statement, and there's a lot to unpack. A carbohydrate, as a simple carbohydrate, meaning white bread, something that is, and again, and I try to speak an easy way to think of things in generalizations. If it's bound to fiber, it's okay. So, for instance, dates, I eat them pretty much every day. Kiwis, blueberries, you know, brown rice. Trying to think of others. You know, anything that is a complex carbohydrate is okay.
Bananas, for example, or would
sure,
that be a wrong example? Yeah.
Under my diet strategy. Now, if someone's watching their carbs, they're going to say, "Well, I eat, you know, nothing." Well, that may or may not be true, but they're probably eat some amount of carbs. And the way we make that distinction of simple versus complex, meaning bound to fiber, is huge. I'll give you a study, and it's a really neat one. Dates, which is, again, I eat them every day, medjool dates. They come from just south of you guys. They have a high sugar content. So, you know, sugar is bad, is what we're told. There's an awesome study with obese people with metabolic disease, and this was in the Middle East, and they gave them dates. 30 days, they can eat as many medjool dates as they possibly can. And these guys obviously loaded up, and they found no increase to visceral fat, no BMI increase, and no impact on metabolic factors. Now, some people say, well, that's just one study. Well, with respect to this, I can go back to 1987, and I can find plenty of studies that replicate what I just told you. In as much as the question of distinction is whether it's a carbohydrate bound to fiber, as in a complex carbohydrate, or a simple carbohydrate. Yes.
And this would also speak to people that are currently battling diabetes type 2, right? Because that's a major factor, that they want to avoid all kinds of sugar. But the moment that you bind this sugar to some type of fiber, then the release is much slower, right? And then the spike in your blood sugar is much lower. So that could be a solution in that regard, right?
Yeah, and I would combine I basically am on a high carb diet, but I'm on a high carb diet that I eat within a short window of time. Now, someone that's watching this will say, this guy's full of, you know, S, and you know, that can't be true. Well, I mean, I'm at the same body weight today with no gym that I was 25 years ago. And I don't count carbs. I just eat in a small window. It works. It's sustainable, and it might work for someone else. And I've heard the same. But in terms of diet, avoid simple sugars. I think everyone agrees on that. You know, cut out the Coca-Colas, the Gatorades, the simple carbohydrates, garbage. I don't know anyone that wouldn't agree on that one. Neither the vegan community nor the keto community would tell you this. And again, they're probably, if someone's watching, they're thinking this more full of S this guy is, and they can put a comment. That's fine. You're entitled to your own opinion and conclusion. But
we have say,
they will say, you know, that animal fat, you know, all animal protein's the same. without any consideration of, basically eating a hamburger is the same as eating lean chicken breast. No, that is not true.
It's also maybe just to get a little bit into the details, right? Probably these people have heard of chemistry, right? And of biochemistry and of proteins being built up out of certain atoms and certain sub-molecules, if you would like to put it that way. And proteins is just a family of a really, really large amount of different types of molecules, right? So to me, it would it's from a basic high school type of chemistry, it would seem totally ridiculous to me that somebody would say all proteins are the same. That's just like so much beside the truth that even a 12-year-old may be able to get that down and say that's an S&S argument, right?
Well, you get why they say this. I mean, there's a ideological justification for the. I mean, if you're only eating animal products, you want to avail yourself to as many and all that you can. I believe, like true keto, it only cuts out cold cuts. I could be wrong, but I believe they eat everything else and as much of it as they can. I did that diet, and I was hungry all the time. I didn't feel very good, low energy, terrible mood. And there's nothing worse than eating a big, or what you thought was a big meal, and 90 minutes later, opening the fridge and some sort of weird, scavenging for something else to eat. It sucks being hungry. So, but yeah, I think if you can lower your animal fat content, and I eat seafood still. I don't eat it all the time, but I probably eat it 2 to 3 times a week, 1 to 3 times a week. And I do fine with it. And again, these guys like to say, well, seafood is meat. That is true. I'm not saying it's not. However, there is a distinction. And again, whatever we can do to maintain and manage sustainability in terms of what we do. The diet I'm on, I've been on 10 years this fall. That's some pretty good sustainability. It's not some fad that I picked up yesterday. I've made some adjustments, of course. If I eat seafood, I take chlorella to absorb the plastic and the heavy metals. And you always want to adjust and make adjustments that are subjectively, individually needed and necessary.
Yeah, well, I would say the same goes for me, right? I've been on a vegetarian diet since I was 16. Well, I'm almost 43 now.
Yeah.
And people always keep telling me, well, isn't there something that you're missing, right? I missed a piece of meat on my plate, right?
Right.
And I'm like, well, I survived for 27 years now, so probably I'm doing something right, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I've survived this long, and also not a lot of neurological issues. Maybe around my 20s or something like that. But that's an age, I believe, or an age period that a lot of people have troubles with their mindset and the way they're feeling about things, because that's also the point until you're 27 or around that point that your brain still is developing, and at that point it sort of stops for the large part, right? Of course, there's some areas that are still evolving and there's some neuroplasticity, but the beginning of your 20s is a difficult period neurologically.
Yeah, and you want to check in and listen to how you feel. It's not just gaining weight. How do you feel? I meet a ton of these keto guys that have anxiety disorders. I know why, but are they interested in no? All right. Well, good luck managing the symptoms.
Yeah. It's very, very difficult to actually give information to people and have them absorb it if they're not really open to your answers.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something I learned long ago. Just if people are not interested in your story, then it's useless to just tell it, right?
Yeah. And so I mean, I think, and this is what I tell friends. They say, well, I don't want to, for instance, give up meat altogether. I don't want to give up, and I, no one will tell them this. I say, great, don't, and they look kind of weird. And I said, just reduce. There's some value in that. If I'm talking to inflammatory meats, that even the keto people will agree on. Cold cuts, for instance, terrible for you. don't eat them every day.
Yeah.
There's some value in that.
And then,
And again,
then also there's maybe there are some people just can't stay away from cold cuts, right? But then
right.
still there's some additives, some things, some substances you can add to your food that will
Yeah.
actually alleviate this problem to some extent. Maybe we talked about omega-3, right? And maybe I think your preference is for krill oil, if I'm
Yeah.
correct. So there are some things you can do, and so I think people should be aware of these things, right? And then if they have some kind of addiction or can't stay away of some type of food, then at least mind's part of the solutions that are there.
Yeah, I mean, reduction is a strategy, and it
Mm,
works. I mean, it's not as good as elimination. It's not as good as being on the diet that works best for you, but I mean, it just makes common sense. And again, in this all or nothing world that we're in, we don't think like that, and we don't talk like that. We want to tell people, no, they need to be doing this, they need to be doing that, and that's why people just throw their hands in there and
mm,
give up. It's well, F it. I can't be, I can't be perfect.
mm,
Well, that shouldn't be the goal. You still have to live, and you still need to enjoy yourself. Some people drink alcohol. I
mm.
do. Not all the time, and I don't get drunk anymore, really. But enjoy. Just use some intelligence with it.
Yeah.
NAC, for instance, we believe can block the harmful effects of alcohol in the liver. Why
Mm,
not use it? I wrote an
mm,
article, on just common sense. 1 to 2 drinks for a man, it might actually confer some legitimate health benefits.
mm,
Blood thinning, some cardiovascular support.
mm.
And again, what does everyone say? No, all alcohol is bad. There's
Yeah.
actually one study that says that. But
Mm,
why do we need to talk and think in these absolutes? You get to live once, so
mm.
make and figure out how to strategically live your life with being able to enjoy it here and there, and make it what strategies you're on sustainable. So to answer your question, I think integrating a sustainable life is and one that you're not constantly jumping from cart to cart.
Mm.
I think makes a lot of sense.
Then maybe we should to the point we referred to earlier, right? Like the neurological diseases. Like what are some of the main substitutes you would actually say are well freely available, probably, right, in form of supplements or that kind of thing, that would be an alternative to these SSRIs or benzodiazepines, as we know them in the Netherlands, like that block your dopamine or block your glutamate.
Yeah.
What are some more natural solutions to that?
So the problem, in every class seems to have their, every class seems to have their, of all the different neurotransmitters, each one seems to have their own drug class that has, it's problematic.
Mm,
Lowering dose obviously is a good strategy. Once again, that's reduction. Lowering the number of drugs that you're on. Again, do
mm,
this with your psychiatrist, but don't take 14 drugs. No one needs to be, generally speaking, no one needs to be on 14 medications. And limit the number of drugs you're on. Try to avoid the ones that are really dangerous for your brain, such as anticholinergics,
mm,
SSRIs. There's way better MAO-A inhibitors now. If someone needs to be on a medication. The stimulant medication for dopamine, again, they found that in low dosages, it's neuroprotective, meaning it protects your brain.
mm,
And of course, the opposite's true once you go past a low dose of it. Some of the acetylcholine drugs, can be good. Then, a lot of the GABA ones have their issues. So starting with serotonin, you know, um, again, assuming that's what someone actually needs, that they
mm.
need more serotonin. Um, and
How
again,
would you determine that you have low serotonin? What would you experience in your life, or what type of symptoms would you experience?
well, again, this is a real subjective, difficult one. There's no way to
Mm,
test for it. There's no
mm,
test for serotonin levels.
mm.
So
Maybe
this is
maybe short for a
completely
lumbar
subjective.
puncture or something like that.
What's that?
Maybe short of a
Maybe.
lumbar puncture or something like that.
Well, I mean, it's totally subjective. you can get genetic testing that tells you, tells you about your MAO-A and B, which are the enzymes that break down serotonin amongst the other neurotransmitters, but you cannot test for actual levels. So, and
But
there's
so
questions.
then it's interesting, because if we arrive at that point that you cannot actually test for those levels, then what is the basis of actually prescribing medication that adjusts those levels? That would normally be the way to go about prescribing medication, right? You test for some kind of level of a substance in your body, and then you try to correct for it. So what is the way that a medical doctor goes about prescribing this kind of neurological medication?
Well, again, there are some newer drugs that seem to be better than SSRIs. But the problem with SSRIs, as we discussed earlier, is that they do have profound side effects. Maybe not as much as the old tricyclics and the old MAOIs, which, basically those are the 3 type of antidepressant drugs used on label for depression. But the problem is that, when they test SSRIs in studies, they don't really perform any better than placebo. So it's basically, if we're just being fair, it's a placebo drug that has the potential for side effects. And that's not.
That's a pretty severe conclusion, right? Because a lot of people on that type of medication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they found we found several supplements are equally effective to SSRIs. So my thought on it is, if you think you need serotonin, and that's where you might be deficient, why not go to the supplement route if you haven't already started on a SSRI? SSRIs do have withdrawals issues, and there are dangers with ending use of it. But let's go through some of them, and really, before I do, just to close the loop, how do you know? All I can say is this: you just have to see how it makes you feel. It's the same exact way a psychiatrist tells you. It's the same subjective reasoning that a psychiatrist tells you when he sends you home with an SSRI, which is typically what everyone gets as a first line of treatment. If your serotonin has been activated, you'll notice that things subjectively look and feel brighter. That's probably the what I can give is that there's a brightness.
Like you mean mood wise, you mean?
Yeah, but you also see things brighter.
You mean like actually more light seems to be there at the same time? Okay.
Yeah, like everything's brighter. That's how I experience it. Is it experienced that way universally? I don't know. I'm not in someone else's body, but I've heard other people. And again, this is pure anecdote because that's all we got. I've heard other people describe it the same way. Things look and feel brighter. Is it the cure-all? Like, did it fix me? And interestingly enough, not a single SSRI ever made me feel that way in terms of serotonin activation. So I don't even know what they were doing to I was taking them. Certainly not making me feel better. I tried them. I don't even know how many.
So what are some of the substances you used that actually made you look and feel brighter?
Well, so if we're still on serotonin. Saffron is one. A lot of people use kratom. I'm not advocating it. I know that a lot of people have a stigma with it, and it's unjustified and it's unscientific, and it's just people. It's a plant from Southeast Asia that's new, even though it's been used for 200 years. And people, anything that's new we have some fear of it, but it activates serotonin. It activates, it activates your dopamine as well. Is it perfect?
I know some people who took it It helped them with getting from antidepressiva to stop using it.
Yeah.
And also other drugs. Yeah. But you have to take it in small doses, and not every day, but 2 times a week or something like that. Yeah. Well, we'll continue.
Yeah. No. I mean, there's a lot of evidence it works for depression. Some people claim that it helps them with insomnia, but I've seen the opposite also with some people. Some people claim it helps them with anxiety. I've also seen the opposite. But depression in particular, it seems to have a lot of support. As well, chronic pain and opioid or other, I've seen it used for alcoholism, addiction, basically addictions. And it has several other effects, but it raises serotonin. I've used it. When I was depressed, I used it every day. And all the horror stories and the people say about getting addicted to it, please. I used it every day and then I quit, but not a single issue. And I'm not saying everyone's experience can be like that, but plenty of people report the same. But when I took it, things looked brighter, things felt brighter. That's serotonin activation. Saffron, curcumin, if you get the right one. Curcumin is a fantastic drug that, in my opinion, outside of my top 5, it's number 6. If you get the right one, and it has a ton of benefits, it inhibits MAO-A and B and COMT. It is that and krill oil are probably it's the best combo as far as I'm concerned for depression.
And the interesting thing is that combination, it also reduces the amount of inflammation in your body as well, right? Like krill oil and curcumin. So you have a double effect, sort of.
Yeah, and there's a lot of junk curcumin. A lot of it's a waste of time and money. Even the 95% standardized extracts, I can't think of anything else that you could say this about. Garbage. They just basically, your body doesn't absorb them. So there's 3 specific kinds. I wrote a big review of curcumin that someone can look up, but you want to get the right kind. And if you get the right kind and you combine it with krill oil, it'll increase the amount of DHA in the brain. It'll increase your DHA levels.
To be clear, DHA is one type of omega-3, right?
Correct.
Like the other famous ones are EPA, which has long been thought is also essential, but now seems to be less so. And ALA, which can be transformed into both if you have enough time
it's not real efficient, and it has the same problem that although it's a conversion mechanism, it has the same problem that curcumin has of it actually reaching the tissues. There's algae oil if someone wants to remain vegan, and there's actually evidence, believe it or not, which is kind of surprising, that algae oil is even better than krill. There's also evidence that shows vice versa. But the big distinction with these is phospholipids, which is phosphatidylcholine, which is basically the membrane of the human body. So it's like, imagine and think in terms of people ask, why is that better than fish oil form or cod liver oil? And cod liver oil is better than fish oil, by the way. It's like if you had the right key, if you go home tonight and you put the wrong key in the keyhole versus putting the right key, having the phospholipid form, phosphatidylcholine, that is in terms of absorption, a big deal. And that's actually how they got curcumin. There's a product called Mariva, and that's how they got curcumin to actually absorb in the body. And they got it to go from something that basically is not absorbable to something that's absorbable.
And I believe you can get like many types of supplements these days in phospholipid form, right? Like maybe also in fluid form in bottles, right?
Lecithin is a phospholipid, and it's vegan. And you could use that to increase absorption of, whatever it is you're taking. But CoQ10 is another one. It's essential. We lose it as we get older, starting 35, 40, depending on what study you read. And CoQ10 is not very well absorbed in the body. So yeah, it's a possible strategy. I know people
And
in the
normally
kratom.
CoQ10 is used to increase the amount of energy in your cells, right?
Well, there's two types. There's
Mm.
ubiquinine and ubiquinol. Ubiquinine is related to energy, the mitochondria ATP energy. Ubiquinol is the antioxidant form, which is what's recommended for people who are on statin medications. And really with ubiquinol, we have to convert it. And the efficiency of conversion is impaired as we get older. So yeah, yes, we make it in the body. The question is, do we make it at an efficient level as we did when we were 20? It appears to be not the case. So that's why you'll see people recommending ubiquinol. Certainly if you're on a statin drug, it's recommended, and actually recommended by medical doctors now.
And maybe interesting for the younger viewers, right? I believe we're all sort of, the people that are here in this conversation are sort of aging at this moment. So for us, it's
boomers.
Yeah, no, well, of course we're a generation later, but explain that to to the 20-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
But for us, it's like a serious matter, right? We are actually seriously interested in products and supplements and substances that actually do work. So
Yeah.
we're in this with our with our own life's interest, right? So we're serious about it. This is not something we just like frivolously discuss and say, well, you
Right.
could use that, you could try that and experiment with your own body. It's essential to us to have the right type of supplement, and we're vigorously searching those kinds of supplements, right? And we want to know what works. So I believe that's why this show, this moment is important, right? And why we are the right people to discuss it also. We have an interest in it.
Yeah, you really don't want to waste money on, and it's not just wasting money, but you also don't want to be counterproductive with what you take.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you want to be efficient, and you can spend a fortune on supplements, and you can take a whole bunch of them, and it's really never ending. You know, and then you always have people chirping in your ear, oh, you need to take this. Well, what happens if you listen to
The
them all of a sudden?
average size of a microwave, right? I'll try to explain. It's like maybe 30 by 20 centimeters. I don't know. It's that in inches, maybe 12 by 10 inches or something like that. And the entire top of that microwave in my house is filled up with bottles of supplements. I think maybe 3/4 of them I never use. There's only 1/4 that I've maybe in the last few years. Those are the ones I use, and those are the ones I keep reordering.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now in this COVID-19 crisis, I order selenium and zinc, vitamin D, vitamin E, and maybe some general multivitamin supplement, and that's
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
I don't go about taking all these kinds of different supplements that maybe do something or maybe interfere with what I'm actually trying to reach. So be specific about it, right? And have a goal in mind of what you want to focus on.
Yeah,
Because,
figure out what you actually need. I mean, I
Mhm.
used to probably take 40, 50 things,
Mhm.
and I'm about half that now,
Yeah.
which it still sounds like a lot for most people, but
Mhm.
you know, I get an ROI on them, and the ones I take work. I know they work.
Mhm.
I mean, does a multivitamin work? I believe it does. I don't actually feel it, but
Mhm.
you know, and
But
does
speaking in terms of ROI, like return on investment, right?
yeah.
What would you say is the financial benefit of using supplements instead of being on regular medication if you would actually fully pay for the medication that you would get from a medical doctor?
Sure, and that's a good question. Really good question. My background and probably my earliest influence at the University of Arizona was Dr. Wheel, Andrew Wheel. He has a website. I don't even know what it's called. I think wheel.com. He started the school of what's called integrative medicine. So this is a medical doctor that had a big influence from Eastern medicine. And he basically, you know, his idea in formulating the integrative school, and a lot of it's outdated. He hasn't updated his website, and people complain that, you know, that he's still promoting soy and stuff, and for good reason. You know, with new information, we evolve. But generally speaking, overall, his major contribution was the idea of integrative medicine. And a lot of the way I think was influenced heavily by how his school is basically puts out their thought is natural first, and if you still need a medication, then have at it. But it's not about taking 14 medications and trying medication first. Some people need to be on drugs, absolutely. I can find you something natural for pretty much everything. But is it going to work for everyone? Are they willing to do the things that are needed in their lifestyle to make it work? Because there's only maybe 5 to 10 supplements that are 100% as effective, or maybe more than their counterpart RX drug. So I think that integrative thought process is how I look at it, and I think it would benefit others to look at it that way, and limit the amount of medications that they take.
And if you look at it cost wise, and I don't know if you were fully covered for all the types of medication you had in your past, right? No, so maybe you could make a comparison of what you were spending each month on those medications, what you're spending now on supplements.
Well, it's hard to compare, because I think, look at it this way. For instance, I take ubiquinol. It's essential, in my opinion, once you're in your late 30s, 35, 40. I don't feel it, because in order to actually feel it, you would need to be taking the ubiquinone form and at a big dose. So I just take it for the antioxidants, and it protects your heart and protects your cardiovascular system, the oxidation of LDL. We talked about all these things. Is it going to save me money in the long run on healthcare, meaning spending money today for a ROI in the future? I believe so, and that's kind of one of my, if it's something that doesn't benefit my energy or mood, meaning I don't actually feel it, then it needs to be essential and something that is going to save me in the long run. So that's I know that doesn't really answer your question, but that's the way I look at it. Medications, we have what's called a copay. So you'll pay X amount, and those have gone up, and some of them aren't covered by insurance at all, and they can get crazy expensive. You could have $40 copay. So a medication could be more than a supplement. And I think a lot of it is figuring out, again, what you need. So a lot of medications are prescribed unnecessarily. And a doctor say, well, how can someone like me without a medical degree make that statement? But they know there's truth in it.
Yeah, and then probably what you were saying is that the amount of copay that you have to pay might be higher than the cost of supplements. But then there's also the part that's in your insurance, right? And you already paid for that, or maybe the government paid for part of it. But there's a cost in that also, but it's more hidden, right?
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that happens in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we have part of your salary that's taken out of it. That's actually used to finance basic care in the Netherlands. So that's a type of finance that you never see, and that you could probably never save money on, because it's taken out of your salary anyway. And then you have what we call your own risk. That's probably the same, sort of the same as copay in the United States. It's to a certain amount, and then that also costs money that you could probably save if you would mind your health a bit more, and if you maybe took the right supplements at a certain point, right? So probably there's something to be saved in that, and I hope people will at least mind their own health, and if it's not for the money, then for their own body and their own well-being, right?
One thing that's real exciting, I think we touched on COVID, and I don't want to talk about it at length, but here's the question is, with all these vitamin D studies showing adverse events, does this open up the opportunity to finally talk about, like, what was the cost of not, if you're dead or you lost, you walked out of the hospital with 35% reduced lung function, what was the cost in not taking the vitamin D supplement? So
I know it. Yeah, I know. So several people that have health issues right now, right? They're in their 60s, maybe 70s, and experiences severe health issues, probably mostly with cardiovascular system or something with breathing or muscular pain. I don't know, different types, right?
Yeah.
And they're what they call in the Netherlands people who enjoy life. So
Yeah.
they like to eat out a lot, and they don't mind what they're eating, and they're drinking a lot, and they're enjoying life, right? To smoking, whatever, right? And it's their own responsibility. And in the end, they're probably content with the end result because they said, well, at least I enjoyed life, right? So I think to a certain extent, it's also a choice, but
Yeah.
to actually have other people co-pay for your health, that's a bit of
Oh yeah.
a stretch, right?
Well, and this was my point, is that in the USA we're paying a heavy price for the neglect of health. It has to be reconciled at some point, and this can't continue the way it's been going. And yeah, we're a large country, and yes, the government was incompetent, and yes, the government didn't intentionally ignored the intelligence. But a fourth factor is our sickness. If this continues, and I wrote an article on this one too. We're not healthy enough Americans are not healthy enough to go back to work. We are all paying the collective price in terms of this herd immunity for having a society that is 45% sick. That's just unsustainable. We're carrying them all on our backs, not just with our pocketbook, although you could say that this prolonged this prolonged shutdown was basically cost all of us, and it did. But our cost of care is affected by this, and I don't know. I don't have the answer other than the obvious, but yeah, I think it's healthcare is expensive due to the collective. Sure, absolutely.
But still, you like I did in the Netherlands, you watch the graphs for how COVID-19 developed in the United States, right? And I think in the Netherlands, the curve is almost finished, like it's almost flattened out, and we're probably somewhere at the end, right? So people don't worry about it that much anymore. But how is that now in the States, and how has that development been, and what do you expect for the near future, or maybe the end of the year, when probably this virus will return?
Well, you guys are healthier than us, and I believe it. You had a few weeks where it started on us. I don't know. I know some European countries are healthier than others, but we have an obesity epidemic, and I think it's going to come. I mean, assuming we have a second wave, which there's no reason to think that we won't, and all we can do is assume at this point. Assuming we have a second wave, the obesity problem is another lead. It's a lead anchor, and the fact that people aren't taking it seriously, and it's just going to make it spread more. And I don't have a problem with the way Sweden handled it in terms of trying it. You can't fault them for that. It looks like he was wrong. The Minister of Health was wrong. So what? At least it was a plan. We never had a plan. So, and we still don't have a plan. So the lack of a plan combined with sick people is not a good formula. So I don't know.
And then there would be, we talked about this earlier in the show, right? That you also have the idea that the American people don't take enough responsibility for their own health, right?
Right.
So how would you say that came about, and what would be a way out of that?
It's the American phenomenon is you remember when you were a kid and you were 5 years old and you were playing and you got angry at the game. I guess you guys play soccer, obviously, and you grabbed your soccer ball and you said, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home. You can't tell me what to do. Yeah, there's a lot of that colors our thinking, and I think affects all of us to some degree. But I think it's the conflation of of freedom, meaning eat whatever you want, which is great. If that's what you want to do, you should have the freedom to do that. all for it if that's your choice.
Mm.
But do it responsibly with the idea that knowing that there's cause and effect, and there's always consequences to any action. But it's a big problem in the government, and I not a fan of the government in our lives all the time, but at the same token, when the government has tried to make efforts to talk about health, they've been ridiculed, and they've been said that that they're trying to take away people's freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a false complex equivalent, and there's a false equivalency between the two.
I've seen also documentaries about the issue in America of obesity, and one said that it's because of the food pyramid. They say that's scientifically not totally correct.
Yeah.
And the other one was the subsidies for corn, and that's because of that there's a lot of corn syrup in the soft drinks.
Yeah.
And in the Netherlands or in Europe we have other forms of sugar. They're less make you less fat, and they say that's also a reason that the Americans get so big, fat. Yeah.
Yeah. We add sugar to our sugar.
Yeah, what's the difference between the sugar that is in the soft drinks in Europe and the corn syrup in the USA? You say that makes you more fat.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. The FDA, who I'm generally not a fan of, that stands for Food and Drug Administration, basically our Minister of Health. Think of it that way. I believe that they're trying to invoke some laws to limit the amount of high fructose corn syrup in as an additive. So, basically telling manufacturers and people that you can have your sugary stuff, you just can't have it that sugary. And when it's a universal truth that that the sugar is costing all of us big, then I'm in support of that, and it's a reasonable measure, because no one's going to self-administer and self-regulate on something like this. We tried it, and you're right, it's out of control.
Well, at least you did, right? You managed to cut on those kinds of foods.
I'm one guy. I didn't have a choice.
I don't know. Probably there are more people that are actually minding what they eat and being healthier than other people. So there's probably some distinction between some people and other people that makes it those other people get obese and then the rest of the population does not. So,
but what about stopping subsidizing the corn industry?
Oh, sure, for sure. Of course.
Yeah, I mean, then the corn gets a bit more expensive, and maybe then they put less of it in the drinks.
Let's subsidize your Brussels sprouts. I mean, why aren't
well, that's an interesting thing, right? That in the Netherlands, every type of grocery is now have a value added tax of 21%.
Yeah.
So even the vegetables that actually you would think that a government would want to sort of subsidize or tax less, but no such thing.
Yeah, it's, our priorities are messed up.
That's weird, right? Yeah.
And what do you think about the food pyramids?
It's a joke. No one looks at it. I think we stopped looking at it.
We have in our country we have it, and especially the boomer generation, they are taking it very seriously. So, but they are kind of like brainwashed in the schools, and
Yeah, but that also had to do with grandpa's telling a story here, but it also has to do with that we had a sort of overflow of agricultural products, like after the Second World War. Then there was the assignment for the Minister of Agriculture in the Netherlands was to increased production, like maybe tenfold or something. And then at a certain point, we had the butter mountain and the milk lake, and we had to get rid of those, right? Because there was way too much production coming out of agriculture. And
Yeah.
so we had these commercials on TV saying milk is the white engine, right? Those kinds of things. You're lucky that you're in the States, but
And we produced
I
too
remember
much
that.
apples.
I
Too
remember
much
that from
apples.
the 80s, from the beginning of the 80s, that you actually had these things, and people now they just can't believe that we had those kinds of commercials, but they were there, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
And eat healthy, eat an apple.
yeah,
Because we produce too much apples.
yeah.
Well, I mean, apples are I think the number one most heavily pesticided food on the Dirty Dozen list. But, you know, if you get organic
You
one,
have to look at
at
them
least
now.
up in fiber.
They are totally shiny. They even
Uh-huh.
give light in the
Wow.
dark.
Yeah.
That's a weird thing, right? It's supposed to be a fruit, so you'd probably think that's healthy to eat just as is, right? But you probably first have to wash it with dishwasher soap or something like that. It's
Yeah,
totally
you
weird.
soak in apple cider or vinegar and baking soda
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, nasty.
It's a weird world. Okay. So yeah, we got stuck actually at serotonin, and not to make this a very long show, but I would like to address like two major neurotransmitters or
Sure.
neuromodulators in your brain, and that's dopamine and GABA. I
Okay.
think there's those two are like together with serotonin are like some of the main regulators in your mind, right? And of course with GABA comes glutamate, which is in a balance more or less.
Yeah, a good way to think of dopamine and GABA is red light, green light.
Mhm.
GABA is your red light, dopamine is a green light, or gas and brake on a car.
Mhm.
You know, from a metaphoric standpoint. So your dopamine's your motivation, your reward system, pleasure. It's involved with cognition, not to the degree acetylcholine is, but it's a big player. And GABA is your primary inhibitory, meaning it's your primary relaxation neurotransmitter in the body. So, you know, there's two ways to look at it: excess dopamine or slow COMT, meaning or MAO-I, meaning your body's not clearing dopamine, so you have excessive dopamine is causing anxiety, or low GABA activity is causing anxiety. You could also have the same. You could also apply this to sleep and other disorders. Whereas invariably, and again, this is just my theory, I think you can find support for it. Depression, which is basically a process of inhibition, is due to low dopamine activity and or potentially excessive GABA activity. You won't see people describe GABA in that way, but it is possible to go the other way and have GABA trigger depression. In addition, typically excess GABA, and you see this, possibly with people that smoke marijuana, in terms of those effects on the body. But by and large, your dopamine is just, it's a cycle, and you want it working during the day, and you want it working correctly, and you want it functioning correctly. When people abuse drugs, this is when dopamine has dysfunction, meaning that they cause damage to those receptors. And there's obviously a D1 and D2, and they do different things. But what's important is understanding that too much or too little is not good. And
so in that regard, like very, very simple advice probably would be to, if you want to boost dopamine, do it in the morning, right? And stop using products that can actually boost your dopamine several hours before you go to sleep.
Yeah.
That is sort of a very general, logical way of going about boosting your dopamine, right?
Yeah, and some people don't need to boost it. Keep that in mind. We get all these people in these nootropic groups. Well, how do I raise my dopamine? Do you need to raise it? What do you mean? Well, okay, so let's hit the rewind button. And, invariably people talk about GABA, and generally these are people knowing this is what they need, or they created, they damaged, and you see this, basically drugs of abuse function on GABA, meaning these are, anxiety medications, or substances like phenibut, where they're abused and it damages GABA. And this is how and why people have withdrawal symptoms, and they have issues with getting off of these type of substances. Xanax, of course, but invariably dopamine. People that abuse stimulants, meth, cocaine, pharmaceutical stimulants. Again, these substances have been found to be protective in low dosages. And the opposite in excess of low dosages. Well, these are drugs of abuse. You don't see people abusing drugs that operate on serotonin. You don't see people abusing mushrooms. You don't see people abusing mescaline. You don't see people abusing LSD, partly because of the built-in mechanism of accelerated tolerance, meaning it just basically, for the most part, most of these, except for the short-acting tryptamines, don't work the next day. So because
maybe with the exception of say MDMA or ecstasy, that you can actually sort of overdose on.
You can't. I mean, those have built-in tolerance mechanisms as well, where they just don't really. There's reports where people have used them 3 times and they stopped working altogether from 3 usages. So, I think why people have issues there, it's a little deeper than just serotonin and a little deeper than just dopamine. But when a drug is concentrated primarily to dopamine, as we see with classical stimulants, or sedatives, as we see with GABA, that's where they, and they abuse them. That's when they have damage. And they manifest themselves in different ways. You see anhedonia, depression, typically with dopamine. And this is people that they lose their motivation and desire. They basically, it's basically a condition of depression where you lose the feeling, of pleasure.
Yeah, but I think maybe for some people that the problem of using drugs that boost their serotonin, they arise when they combine it with certain other substances. So say, for example, SSRIs or MAO-Is, that actually takes the release of the serotonin off, and it stays in their head and it sort of explodes, and you get a, what do you call it, sort of a serotonin paranoia or something. I can't really remember. When you get an excess of serotonin, that's not really a pleasurable experience, to say the least, right?
Right, you're talking about serotonin syndrome. So 5-HTP and of course MDMA both can do that because they're directly binding rather than mimicking the effect of serotonin. And this is a big distinction, when we talk about serotonin substances, people just grab 5-HTP because it's the most common. And I have a story from taking 5-HTP, and when I didn't really know what I was doing, and I consider myself reckless because I didn't fully research things, and luckily I didn't do any damage, but I could have, and I had an adverse reaction, and this is no knock on 5-HTP in general. It's appropriate for certain people at the appropriate dose when used correctly, but a lot of people are better off using serotonin substances that are not as problematic in that sense as 5-HTP and are more lighter substances.
Yeah.
But so and there's plenty of them, and that act on in the mimicking of serotonin and will in effect boost the subjective experience and feeling of serotonin, and possibly as well MAO-A and B.
But so for people that actually did the research very well, right, and they experienced that they have either shortage or too high a level of dopamine or too high or low a level of GABA. What would be the substances that have effect on those levels?
So there are two that are probably the strongest dopamine. They call them dopaminergics in the nootropics community that I can think of. I use one of them, Mucuna pruriens. It's velvet bean from Africa, and it actually, interestingly enough, has trace amounts of tryptamine, which is a psychedelic in it. You're not going to experience that, but just an interesting side note. But it's a long-acting dopamine compound. There's also one from Brazil, Catuaba. I've taken them both, and personally, I see a lot of people will say Catuaba is stronger, but I found that there's no crash with Mucuna. I've taken Kratom as well, which acts on dopamine, and I just find that Mucuna is better in terms of more longer acting and just a better overall. It's an adaptogen, so it has some other benefits.
Yeah, and those are like substances that you could actually take for a long amount of time, or do you? Yeah. So that's, in that regard, they're much more safe than, say, for example, even caffeine, right? If you take that much caffeine a day, and some people, they go up to maybe 8 cups a day, right? If you look at Finland, they sort of score at the highest top of the world, and they take those kinds of amounts of caffeine, and you see withdrawal symptoms if they need to stop at a certain point.
Caffeine's a medicine for me, and I think for people that have dopamine issues, I think it's a bona fide medicine, and I use about 4 large cups a day, 3-4 large cups a day, which is appropriate. Up to 4 has health benefits. Once you go past that, you lose it. It seems to be the consensus, but that could change. But yeah, that is I think caffeine is pretty important. I drink iced coffee in the morning, then green tea or matcha tea or cocoa.
But cocoa is like more theobromine, right? So not caffeine per se.
It has a little.
It's xanthine as well, but it's like the same family, slightly different effect, right?
Smoother effects.
And longer lasting, probably, right?
Oh yeah.
But we have some activity in the chat.
Oh, what's the question?
Somebody said MAO-A or something like that.
I'll check in chat, right? Just one moment.
MAO-A, I don't know. Is that some kind of drug or?
Can you spell it?
BHB OAY.
BHB.
Ben je er al, Rik?
BABABOEY.
Yeah.
Baba Booey.
Never heard of it.
That's I believe that's a character on the Howard Stern show.
Okay. Probably.
Trying to make a joke since I'm American.
And some people say hi and hello, so hello, Ben.
Yeah. Hi, people. Welcome to the show.
What is up?
What's up?
Okay, so just like to get to the final chapter, and maybe then just call it a day, right? What are some of the main substances that have an effect on GABA? Personally, I know of theanine and what do you call it, taurine, right? Those are some very simple things that you can probably find in any health store.
Black seed oil is really popular right now. That's one of the main ones I recommend. I think everyone needs magnesium, and you can get a bioavailable magnesium. And I recommend that people that need GABA and that have anxiety issues and or sleep issues, or as well maybe even glutamate issues, meaning that schizophrenia, stuff like that. So other more significant, more severe mood issues. I recommend that they get their magnesium either in taurine form, which is similar to theanine, or magnesium glycinate. And that's a good way to get your magnesium, which we all need, and we're pretty much all deficient of, 80% if you want to be technical. And then get a calming amino acid that works on GABA. Some other options, a lot of people are using Bacopa. Magnolia is a pretty common one. Xanthohumol hops is probably the best sleep aid one for GABA. I've seen in Europe, you guys have probably the #1 most prescribed GABA plant-based, and it's a medicine apparently, but it's called the Three Sisters of GABA. It's valerian combined with, you can get it, I guess they sell it at any pharmacy there.
Yeah.
It's German, and it's a #1 compound. Valerian, hops, and purple passion flower. That's their combo. And
we can get it in the local drugstore. Yeah, no problem whatsoever.
Yeah. It apparently has. I find it hard to believe, but they found it as efficacious as zolpidem, the Ambien, the sleep, the Z drug for sleeping.
I actually used the GABA sublingual for a while, and I had it, probably for me it had a really large effect, right? I just put it under my tongue, and maybe in 15 minutes I was like, I was gone. So if you have any form of being stressed about the day that has gone past, or you're anxious about what's coming, just look at your GABA probably, and then see if you can do something about that. It will probably help a lot with your quality of life.
I tell people start with magnesium glycinate or taurinate, because again, it's something we need. Start with the things that you need, and see if that helps, and it should.
And then apart from GABA, right? The magnesium is, as I remember correctly, if I can remember correctly, is used in maybe 70 different processes in your body at least, right?
Yeah.
So it's not only for your mood, but it's also for cramps in your muscles, for example. It's a very famous example. And there are probably a lot of different functions that I'm not even talking about here. But
300 actually.
300, yeah.
Over 300. Yeah, it's #4, I think. I can't remember. Yeah. But it's a critically important nutrient that I believe 80% of us are deficient in. Because you just don't get it in diet anymore.
And I think it's also important to talk about the reason why we're deficient, not only because it's not in our diet a lot anymore, because a lot of people just don't eat enough vegetables, for example, like cauliflower or broccoli or that kind of thing. But also because we're stressed out a lot more, and that uses up your magnesium, right? So a lot of food nutritionists will say to you, well, normally if you eat healthy, it should be enough in your food, but that's not the only factor. If you have a very busy job, if you have a very busy life, if you experience a lot of stress, say, for example, relationship-wise, if you're moving to a different place, moving to a different house will also bring a large amount of stress. So there's a lot of factors that can influence magnesium levels in your body, and it's good to mind that, I think.
Yeah, again, start with the essentials. You need them anyways. It may or may not help you with specific to this mood issue.
Yep.
I believe it blocks excessive NDMA or glutamate as an NDMA blocker, and that's a good thing, which means it has a neuroprotective benefit on the brain. Zinc does the same, but yeah, start with those things which they're cheap. You need them anyways, and then add the non-essentials after you already have the essentials working for you.
Very good. I think that's a nice end note, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you everybody for listening.
All right, guys.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Mark, for being a guest on the show.
Yeah.